These don't amplify.
Oh, all right. I will speak up.
That would be good. You got it? Okay. Welcome to the fourth hearing of the Public Accountability Committee's inquiry into the government's management of the COVID-19 pandemic. The inquiry is intended to provide ongoing parliamentary oversight to the government's response to the unfolding pandemic. Before I commence, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, who are the traditional custodians of this land, and I'd like to pay my respects and those of this committee to the elders past, present and emerging of the Eora Nation, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal peoples present. This afternoon we will hear evidence from the witnesses from the planning portfolio, including the Minister for Planning and Public Spaces, the Honourable Rob Stokes. The New South Wales Government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic cuts across many portfolios and arms of government, each with a particular role to play in responding to both the health and economic dimensions of the pandemic. Even after we get through the worst of the public health crisis, the road to economic recovery will be long and difficult. And the role of the state's planning agencies in boosting jobs and stimulating activity in a post-COVID-19 world is certainly a matter of public interest and is relevant to the scope of this inquiry. The enormity of what lies ahead of us may indeed warrant some recalibration of policy settings to encourage economic activity. However, we must not repeat the mistakes of the past and allow poor planning decisions that create inappropriate long-term development and unwarranted environmental damage. The balance must be struck more carefully now than ever before. There is clearly a public interest imperative to know that the government has not gone too far and that the planning controls and protections we rely on to ensure good planning outcomes, protection of the environment and livable neighbourhoods are not bent too far in our haste to stimulate the state's economy. As we've recently seen in the building industry, proper planning controls and effective regulatory oversight are paramount. These are matters that will be considered in this afternoon's hearing. I would now like to make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearing. Today's hearing is being broadcast live via the Parliament's website. A transcript of today's hearing will be placed on the committee's website when it becomes available. In accordance with the broadcasting guidelines, while members of the media may film or record committee members and witnesses, people in the public gallery should not be the primary focus of any filming or photography. Not a concern today with our social distancing rules. I would also remind media representatives that you must take responsibility for what you publish about the committee's proceedings. It's important to remember parliamentary privilege does not apply to what witnesses may say outside of their evidence at the hearing. All witnesses have a right to procedural fairness, according to the Procedural Fairness Resolution adopted by the House in 2018.
Hear, hear.
There may be some questions that a witness could only answer if they had more time or with certain documents to hand. In these circumstances, witnesses are advised that they may take a question on notice and provide an answer within 21 days. I remind everyone here today that committee hearings are not intended to provide a forum for people to make adverse reflections about others under the protection of parliamentary privilege. I therefore request that witnesses focus on the issues raised by the inquiry terms of reference and avoid naming individuals unnecessarily. Witnesses are advised that any messages should be delivered to committee members through the committee staff. I also note that today's hearing is at somewhat of a distance as we are respecting the social distancing rules, and I think you are down there somewhere, Minister, we all will probably need to speak up a little more clearly so as we can be heard, notwithstanding social distancing. All witnesses from departments, statutory bodies or corporations will be sworn prior to giving evidence. Minister, I remind you, you do not need to be sworn as you have already sworn an oath as a Member of Parliament. For all other witnesses, and starting, if we could, with you, Mr Betts, could you please state your full name, position, title and agency, and then take either an oath or an affirmation?
James George Betts. I'm Secretary of the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr Betts. Mr Hebron.
Thank you. My name's James Eric Hebron. I'm General Counsel, Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thanks, Mr Hebron. There would be no harm in speaking up a little more loudly.
No problem.
Minister, the opportunity is now yours if you wish to have a quick opening.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I'm here to answer questions. I respect the ambit of the committee. I think your inquiries are quite appropriate and actually helpful because in leading some of the economic response as well as health response to this crisis. I'm well aware of the pitfalls of that a ill-advised intervention in the planning system can bring about. Obviously, I share the ambition, I think, of most members of this place to make sure that we appropriately balance the long-term social, economic and environmental interests of the state, and to make sure our resources are used wisely and responsibly. And so it's in that spirit that we're here to assist the committee.
Thanks, Minister. I'll hand over to the opposition for the first round.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for coming along. Minister, can you tell us where the Powerhouse Museum Parramatta project is up to in the planning system, and why that didn't appear in either of the tranche 1 or 2 of the fast tracking assessments?
Well, my understanding, and I'll provide some opening and then refer to the Secretary for further specifics, is that there is an EIS that has been largely prepared. I understand that we're waiting for a couple of documents before that is able to be collated and exhibited for public consultation. In relation to its non-inclusion in the tranches, it doesn't meet the criteria as it's not post-exhibition. I'll refer to the Secretary for any further details.
That's a full explanation.
Okay. All right. So what was the criteria for developing the 2 tranches?
So the criteria have been based very directly on the objectives of the Environment Planning and Assessment Act, so the 3 criteria, the first relates to capital investment value and jobs, because the fundamental objective of the planning system, I think the first of the objects outlined in clause 1.2 is to promote the development of the state and its resources. So it's in line with that objective of the Act. The second criteria relates to shovel readiness of projects, to use that hackneyed phrase, so the criteria relates to, in the case of a planning proposal, that it must result in a development application being submitted within 6 months. In the case of a development application, if consent is received, it must result in actual construction commencing within 6 months, and that's in line with an objective of the Act to provide for the orderly development of the state and its resources. So, this sense of a pipeline of orderly development. Mm-hmm. And the third, that wider public interest requirements are met. The public interest in planning law is a little bit more nebulous a concept. Nevertheless, there are some clear pointers given to us in the legislation. We know, for example, affordable housing, public reserves correspond with the public interest. The public interest itself is one of the matters for consideration at clause 4.15 of the Act, and it is basically best defined in contradistinction to private interest. So those things that provide a wider benefit to the community as well. So they're the 3 broad criteria that the department has used in developing the process for determining which of the projects that have been suggested to it should be subject to fast tracking. I'll refer to the Secretary if he has any further to add.
Thanks, Minister. So the priority projects criteria, this document which I'm holding, sits on our website and is publicly accessible. It describes the criteria in more detail. The Minister's just summarised them. And it also points to a process which is overseen by me as Secretary to ensure that those criteria are applied in accordance with a framework which is also overseen by a probity auditor. And that framework has been reviewed and supported by the Independent Commission Against Corruption.
Okay. In relation to the Powerhouse matter, it's obviously just not compliant with the fast tracking assessment criteria, but it's a project that's been kicking around with the government for some 5 or 6 years. Is it your expectations that it will soon fit the criteria and will be able to go into this fast track stream?
Look, it's difficult in one sense to speculate on hypotheticals because we don't actually have a complete EIS for exhibition yet, but it would have to go through those exhibition stages before it would fit into the fast tracking criteria. So that, it certainly would not be in any tranche anytime soon.
Okay.
Might be cleared up on next week's Cabinet hearing.
It may be. I noticed in the first tranche was the Ivanhoe estate. I think that's in the Ryde LGA. But what wasn't in either tranches 1 or 2 was your government's $500 million promised upgrade of Ryde Hospital, or the promised $100 million Macquarie Park bus interchange. Can you inform the committee about where those 2 government committed projects are up to? Are they not in the fast track assessment process because they haven't got to a DA stage, or is it still sort of on the never never?
I think I won't speculate on the wording you've used there, but there are a number of projects in the Ryde area. Obviously, it's an area where there's been a lot of infrastructure development over recent years. Obviously, the metro is a classic example, but also the Meadowbank School precinct, for example. Look, in relation to where those stages are up, where those projects are up to in the planning process, I'm happy to take that on notice. But suffice to say, we look to fast-track public and private projects where they fit the criteria. And my speculation is that they just didn't fit in the criteria at this stage.
Does the Secretary have anything further to add about why those 2 projects are not in either of the fast-track rounds?
I think it's appropriate to take it on notice, but from my past experience as CEO of Infrastructure New South Wales, there are literally hundreds of infrastructure projects being sponsored by the government. That's before you come on to projects being proposed by private sector proponents. So there is a very large volume of projects out there. The purpose of the intent of the acceleration program is to identify projects which can be determined in the ensuing 4-week period. So there will be a large number of projects which are important projects, including to the government, but which are not capable of being determined in that time frame, not least because of the requirements of the legislation that we undergo rigorous public consultation and consideration of the submissions that result from that consultation.
Okay, so you've got the criteria. Do you then just sort of scour the planning system for projects that sort of may or may not meet that criteria? Is there some body or group responsible for assembling likely candidates for fast tracking and then shortlisting them?
Yes.
How does that work?
The Minister's happy for me to answer that question. So within the department, I have 2 deputy secretaries, one responsible for planning and assessment and the other responsible for design and public space, which includes major rezonings or planning proposals. We have obviously our own databases of the proposals and projects which are in the system. We scan those. We've also received, as is well known, a number of representations from members of the community and from members of the development sector about projects that they would like to see fast-tracked through this process. But the analysis which is undertaken against the criteria and within the framework which is endorsed by the probity auditor is undertaken by officials within my department at Deputy Secretary level, and that advice is then presented to me on a regular basis. So we've had 2 tranches so far, as you'd be aware, and the advice has come from the department and been endorsed by me.
All right. Minister, I think on the 28th of April you announced the first 24 projects in tranche 1. Can you or the Secretary let us know how the Visy dry recycling facility got onto the list of projects to be fast-tracked, given that the project had in fact been approved 6 days before the announcement?
I'm happy to either take that on notice or refer to the Secretary for further details.
I think best to take that on notice. I'm not aware of that.
Okay. St Anthony of Padua Catholic School redevelopment was announced the day after the fast track announcement. That is, you announced fast tracking, then the day after you announced that this project had already been sort of ticked. That's a very quick turnaround. Isn't this the case that a lot of these fast-tracked proposals were really almost at the edge of completion, and you've just sort of put them together, badged it as fast-tracking to show that you're doing more than, in fact, was really being done?
No, the short answer is no, because over the same period, so what we saw in the first tranche, over 4 weeks, about $7.5 billion worth of projects went through that process. But over the same period of time, just through the ordinary processes of assessing SSDAs, SSI, and planning proposals through the state processes. About another 2.4 billion was assessed over that same period through the ordinary process. So these were identified because they met those because they met that criteria, and went through a heightened process. Also through the process of selection, it was filtering those that could be dispensed with more quickly. When I say dispensed, could be determined rather more quickly. In the first tranche, there was also a sense, part of what we're also seeking to do here is support confidence in economic activity and encourage investment. Confidence is a big part of that. So identify projects that can be determined very quickly is a big part of boosting confidence. We've refined the processes as the tranches have been developed, and we will see that further refined as more tranches go through the system.
Okay, but I think from what you're saying, I think the way it was portrayed, it was you're looking for projects that can be, swiftly moved through the system, including those that might have been unreasonably delayed. But looking through the ones that have been approved, a lot of them seem to have been very well advanced, and it does seem that they have been chosen simply because they are very close to the edge of completion. I can see how that would help boost confidence by this appearance of the planning system really picking up speed. But that's what it's not really, none of these have been taken from scratch, have they?
He's getting there, Natalie.
I'll be clear there. None of them have been taken from scratch quite deliberately. That is that by their very nature they have to be post-exhibition, because effectively all the evidence to support a decision must have already been gathered. So this now relates to the internal processes within government of literally the grunt work of making a determination based on the assessment. So there's the collating all of that information, applying an assessment weighting to it, but effectively we've had the benefit of council's views, of the community's views. On some of these projects, you mentioned the Ivanhoe estate, for example. I think that had been exhibited on 2 or 3 occasions. So we had a great deal of information, and it was now just a matter of of resources being prioritised within the department. So we literally had the bodies available to undertake those assessments as quickly as possible to get them to determination. Did the Secretary have anything further to add?
Simply that if we're announcing that we're going to determine 24 projects in a tranche, as we did with tranche 1, and that those will be determined within 28 days, then it shouldn't come as a surprise that projects are being determined on a very frequent basis during that 28-day period. And indeed, the process of identifying the projects for the purposes of fast tracking was completed a little while in advance of the announcement being made. So we got cracking immediately as soon as I had signed off on that process. We didn't wait for media events in order to do that. And it sends a signal to industry. Whilst many of the projects which we're determining in the first couple of tranches are projects which, as the Minister said, are at an advanced stage and had to be at an advanced stage because we're not proposing to subvert the planning system in any way here, it sends a signal to people whose projects may be in a queue which is a little bit longer term, that the better job and the more efficient job they can do around getting their documentation together, that the department will be ready to respond efficiently with its determination in the weeks and months ahead. Hence the confidence building message.
Okay. Now just on the issue of confidence building, I think when you announced the fast track program, I think the claim was it would create 9,500 jobs, and a few weeks later, by the end of the first tranche, I think the claim had been increased to 20,000 jobs. By what criteria were you assessing this job creation metric, and how did it suddenly have a sort of an uplift of almost double within just a few weeks?
I question your figures there. I don't think the job figures changed. The original assessment was based on, that was the number of jobs. There's a well-used formula within government to determine how many jobs are created. In most of the projects, from recollection, about a third of them related to construction jobs and about 2/3 related to ongoing jobs. It depends from project to project. But that was about the total number of jobs that could be supported. But of course, that was not seeking to prejudge that every single one of those projects would be approved. In fact, in that first tranche, there was one that was not approved, and so obviously those job numbers would have to be subtracted from the total.
Yeah, so look, just one example from tranche one was the Mount Druitt CBD, that is the LEP, and I think with the documentation for tranche one, the claim was that it would create just under 3,000 jobs. But then when you look at the press release from yourself and the Premier of 21 May, that same project, Mount Druitt CBD rezoning, the claim is that it will create 15,000 jobs. So within a few weeks, it's gone from 3,000 jobs, or slightly less, to 15,000. So just to be clear, you're not saying that's actually the number of jobs that are going to be created over the next 6 or 12 months. It's a figure of how many jobs could be created over what, a decade, 2 decades?
I just so I'm clear, I'll clarify on notice if required. But my understanding is that the job figure initially was the one I understood to be based on the work itself. Mm-hmm. Obviously, a rezoning facilitates development over a much longer period of time, which could support a range of jobs in a range of sectors, not just construction. Mm-hmm. And that would, I imagine, explain the bigger of the two figures. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if the Secretary had more specificity to add to that one.
We've the way in which we assess the employment impacts of projects which are being fast-tracked has evolved over time. We wanted to make sure that, particularly for rezonings, which are intrinsically a longer-term proposition than immediate development applications, that we had in place a methodology which was signed off by the Chief Economist within Treasury, mm-hmm. and was supported by New South Wales Treasury, and we developed that in parallel with the identification of the projects in the first tranche. So we refined our methodology, but always within the context of those criteria where there was a heavy weighting towards jobs.
And what's the time frame that you're using for that? What's the time frame at which you're calculating those jobs now with the new methodology?
Well, there's as has been explained, there's where a DA is being determined, the expectation will be that construction will start within 6 months, and where it's a rezoning, that a DA will be lodged within 6 months, and then we make assumptions around, or projections around, immediate construction jobs and then ongoing jobs which will flow from that over the longer term.
What is the longer term?
Well, I'd imagine.
Notice, yeah.
But I'd imagine it'd be the life of the project, and in the case of a rezoning, it would be the anticipated period over which that rezoning would be facilitated, because generally it's imagined out to a particular end date. Mm-hmm. But I would say on jobs figures, I know that there's always been, and I remember being in opposition, we would take issue with various jobs figures. Can I just encourage the committee or reassure the committee that these jobs figures are certainly tight in relation to the shovel readiness criteria, which is a big part. I think it's actually it's always a challenge in talking with the development industry about ensuring that things are actually delivered in a timely way. But one of the assessment criteria is really getting a granular understanding of how likely these developments are actually to be delivered upon in a short period of time, because of course we all know that there's enormous capacity to speculate on an increased land value, on the basis of getting development consent for something. They're not the projects we're interested in at the moment. The projects we're interested in, and the whole point of the acceleration project, is to sponsor those projects, to support those projects that will develop jobs in the short term, and also a pipeline of jobs into the future.
Sure, and don't misunderstand me, Minister, I'm not so much taking issue with the figures, I'm trying to understand their basis.
And I understand. Yep.
So, for example, most of the jobs claimed around the first tranche do appear to flow from LEP changes.
Yep.
And the Mount Druitt one is a good one, because there's a 7,000 sort of increase from the announcement to a few weeks later afterwards.
Yep.
So are we assuming that that's the estimated or hoped jobs to be created over the 5-year life of that new LEP? Is that a correct assumption?
That would be my assumption as well, but I'll clarify
take on notice.
On notice.
And and I don't know, and I'm not asking if you can't share some sort of state secret, but it would be interesting to understand the methodology that underpinned the original assessment and the sort of, if you like, the final assessment of job estimates, because I note that a fair amount of the dollar value of these projects and the job creation potential flowed from changes to LEPs rather than from specific infrastructure projects. So again, just trying to understand the basis upon which the dollar values were reached and also the job estimates, just so we could sort of understand how the department reached those.
And this is the iterative nature of it. I mean, it was a Herculean effort to get all this done, and
Been critical.
had to work
Just
like
trying to
Hermes
understand.
to get it, through the system as quickly as possible. But in that there were different tranches of projects. I mean, some are planning proposals, so rezonings. They're going to have different characteristics to public infrastructure projects that are going to have different characteristics again to private developments. And even then, obviously, residential developments are going to have different characteristics to manufacturing jobs. So, this is all, it's the utilities comparing within categories, not so much between the different categories of development.
But you'll give that further detail on those.
Absolutely.
Good afternoon, Minister, and Mr Hebron and Mr Betts. There's a COVID-19 response committee or team that you've established within the department. Is that right, Minister?
In relation to matters within the department, it's probably appropriate that I refer
Yes.
to the
Mr
Secretary.
Betts?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
What's it called?
Let me just check.
COVID-19 response something?
I just call it my Deputy Secretary's group. Planning Systems Response COVID-19.
Okay. And that has some deputy secretaries and some others on it.
Correct.
And its purpose, I assume, is to identify projects and processes within the planning that will assist in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Is that right?
Correct. So we have a number of different groups within the department. Sorry if I'm somewhat confused, because we have groups which are dedicated towards ensuring the safety of staff within the department, which meets on a regular basis, which is a crisis management team. And then we have groups within individual areas, whether it's environment, energy and science, or it's in our planning and assessment teams that are focusing, if you like, on the outward-facing response to COVID in terms of the levers the department can pull to support the community through the crisis.
Yeah, things such as if you're pulling together these Tranche 1 and Tranche 2 lists, doing stakeholder engagement to speak with the various proponents, that sort of stuff.
Well, there are a range of different activities. As I've said, stakeholder engagement is an important part of that, but there is a tightly defined decision-making framework overseen by a probity auditor and reporting into me, which sits within that group, which is supported by those deputy secretaries,
Yeah, but I mean, you wouldn't put somebody on a Tranche 1 or Tranche 2, or someone's project on Tranche 1 and Tranche 2, unless you'd done stakeholder engagement. That would have to be part of it.
Well, you might. It'd be if the proposal was already in the planning system, was at an advanced stage, you applied the criteria which have been documented, published, signed off by ICAC, and you found that a project satisfied the three criteria to a significant extent, then you might well fast-track it without engaging with stakeholders.
Minister, but you would agree that it's important, if you're fast-tracking and going through your COVID-19 response, to ensure that there weren't conflicts of interests?
Which is precisely why we sought advice from the Independent Commission Against Corruption, because we're very aware, that a fast-tracking process creates the opportunity for discretion, and with discretion creates the opportunity for corruption. And that's why a probity auditor has been appointed to sit in all the discussions in relation to the selection of projects for potential fast-tracking well before I'm ever involved in the process.
But you agree, ensuring that there isn't a conflict of interest in your COVID-19 response between the interests of the development industry and the department, and through the department, the people of New South Wales, ensuring that there isn't a conflict of interest is important. You would agree?
Well, you've obviously got something in mind, I'm taking the question in the
I have a
abstract.
nice
I'm not
simple
quite sure.
question that I'd just like an answer to, Minister.
Okay, can you ask it again? Sorry.
You would agree that ensuring that there isn't a conflict of interest between the interests of the development industry and the processes and controls of the department, and through that, the protection of the public interest, you would want to make sure that there wasn't a conflict of interest in the department. You didn't have people or processes that created a conflict of interest. That would be important to you, I assume.
Well, of course, conflicts need to be identified and managed, and of course, in the case of public processes, there needs to be a clear separation from the interests of individual corporations or applicants. And I'm satisfied that the process has been developed in such a way to identify and manage any conflicts that might be identified.
And the Minister looks to me as Secretary of the Department to ensure that any employees of the Department or anybody else who is engaged in any of these processes either doesn't have any conflict of interest or certainly doesn't have any conflict of interest that can't be satisfactorily mitigated and managed. That's my responsibility.
Okay, one of the organisations which has a direct interest in the outcome of the Tranche 1 and the Tranche 2 processes and the COVID-19 responses, one of those organisations would be the Property Council of Australia. You would agree with that? They have a clear interest.
Well, I'd actually think more broadly, I think everyone in New South Wales has an interest in
But I'm asking you about the Property Council of Australia. They have a clear pecuniary interest. Their members have a clear pecuniary interest in the outcome.
Well, hang on, you've said two things there. The Property Council having a pecuniary interest and their members having a pecuniary interest.
Well, the Property Council does through its members.
Well, you'd have to speak to them in relation to their interests. But what I can say is that, yes, there are a number of stakeholder groups that are usefully spoken to in terms of identifying what projects are in industry and to advocate on behalf of industry more broadly, and that includes a range of industry groups, including Property Council.
Well, Minister, how is it that your department has seconded an executive director from the Property Council of New South Wales to act as an executive director for the department on the COVID-19 response? Such an obvious conflict of interest. How have you brought on board an executive director from the Property Council and actually put them square in the middle of your COVID-19 response? How has that happened?
Well, point of order, I think you, in fairness, should identify, if that's possible, the person to whom you refer. You're assuming.
Well, I'm happy to put William Power's name on the record if the government insists, but I was endeavouring not to.
I don't wish to embarrass the person.
I was
but
endeavouring
don't
not
assume
to.
knowledge on the part of
Minister-
the Minister of this particular matter.
Minister, how is it that you put an executive director, they move straight from the Property Council on a secondment, not even on a permanent removal, straight from the Property Council, straight on as an executive director on your COVID-19 response? How did you allow that conflict of interest?
A couple of things. I mean, obviously, appropriately, staffing matters are a matter for the Secretary, so I'll refer to him in relation to his decisions in relation to his staffing. But before I do so, I just note in the outset, you did identify that I should be careful not to identify individuals, which you have just done. Nevertheless, I also point out that I want to be clear here. I have no understanding that anyone within the department, certainly not the person you've identified, has done anything untoward, and I don't believe that there is any conflict
I want
of
to be
interest.
clear.
Yeah.
It's the perception of a conflict of interest that I'm raising with you here.
Okay.
Stepping out of, temporarily, the role as an executive director of the Property Council and stepping directly into this key COVID-19 response position within the department, and only doing it as a temporary measure because they're going to go straight back to the Property Council after. Such an obvious conflict of interest. How did it happen?
Well, firstly, so I'll refer to the Secretary in a moment for specifics in relation to staffing matters in the department. But once again, you spoke about a perceived conflict of interest and then you spoke about an actual conflict of interest. I don't believe that to be the case. And I will also suggest that the only way in which such a conflict might arise would be if this person had any role in the assessment or selection of projects. Nevertheless, to answer that question, I'll refer you to the Secretary.
Yes, and so the Minister is right to say that you have simultaneously said that there might be a perceived conflict of interest, and then you've asserted, Mr. Shoebridge, that there is a conflict.
Well, I want to be clear. There is a clear. Well, I want to be clear. If you're concerned, Mr. Betts, there is a direct conflict of interest between the interests of the Property Council and the interests of the department. There's a direct conflict of interest. So I want to be clear.
So, okay. Well, let me give
But
you the
again,
facts.
Mr. Stewart, you said that this gentleman had a conflict of interest. You didn't say the Property Council had a conflict of interest.
Well, there is a conflict of interest if you've taken temporary secondment from the Property Council, where you're the executive director and you are working for the department. If you can't see the conflict of interest, I find that troubling, Minister. But to answer your question, Mr. Betts, a direct conflict of interest is a proposition I'm putting to you.
So, well, that's the assertion you're putting to me. Mr. Power has taken leave without pay from the Property Council on a short-term, fixed-term appointment with the department. He's supporting us in engaging with a range of stakeholders. He's very familiar with the industry from his previous role, but he is not involved in any assessment process. He's not involved in any process of assessing which projects should be fast-tracked for the purposes of determination, and he is certainly not involved in any process associated with the actual determination of those projects. So to the extent that he is entirely distanced from any decision-making role associated with the planning system, he has no conflict of interest. And I'm clear on that as Secretary of the Department, and I'm happy to give the opportunity for my General Counsel, James Hebron, to provide any commentary he might want to provide.
There's little I can add to that, really. There is no direct conflict. There's no direct conflict being... there may be the potential for a perceived conflict, and that has been addressed because Mr. Power's engaged in basically a communications role. He has no role in relation to the decision-making whatsoever, so there is no actual conflict.
And as an employee of the department, all employees of the department are required to declare any interests that they might have so that any conflict of interest flowing from those can be appropriately managed, and I'm satisfied that that process has been followed.
Well, Minister, this gentleman's role is Executive Director of COVID-19 Response (Stakeholder Engagement). Of course, one of the board members of the Property Council of New South Wales is a senior executive from Mirvac. Can you guarantee to this committee that Mr. Power has had no contact at all with Mirvac in his role as an Executive Director of COVID-19 Response?
Well, again, I'll refer you to the Secretary.
I would sincerely hope that he has had contact with Mirvac and with a range of other people in the development sector, as have I. Well, this is a process where we're attempting to support the development sector through a major crisis, but to do so in a way which is entirely consistent with the spirit and the letter of the EP&A Act, of the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, and all relevant probity considerations. But that does not require us to sit in isolation from the major employers in this state and have no communication with them. So I am confident that Mr. Power has had contact with Mirvac and with other peak bodies besides the Property Council, and I would expect him to do precisely that because that's what I'm paying him to do.
Minister, can you understand how the community would be deeply distressed by the response of Mr. Betts, given that Mirvac has had fast-tracked the highly controversial project in West Pennant Hills, which is proposed to clear a substantial amount of forest in West Pennant Hills? Can you understand how disturbed the community would be to hear that the Executive Director of the Property Council was involved in stakeholder engagement for that project?
Well, again, your stakeholder engagement for that project, I don't actually think there's any suggestion that he's been involved in stakeholder engagement for the project. That would be a matter for Mirvac. In relation to the selection of projects, in terms of talking to stakeholders about those sorts of projects that are able to be advanced, Mr. Betts has explained how, of course, the department will communicate with applicants and proponents on a daily basis. It's impossible to imagine a planning system where you can't talk to the people putting in applications. Indeed, that's sort of the point of the planning system, is to have clear engagement, to have a collaborative process of talking to applicants, of talking to councils, of talking to community members, but ultimately to identify projects, to identify all the evidence required to make a determination one way or another in relation to a project. The project of which you speak is one that I think has been lodged a couple of years ago. It's post-exhibition. The council's been thoroughly consulted. Local members have expressed views in relation to
Opposed it. They've all opposed it, Minister.
But
They've all opposed it, and your stakeholder
Mr. Shippings,
engagement person has brought it back on.
That's not a reason not to make a decision in relation to an application. Just leaving applications in limbo forever doesn't actually help anybody. The point is to get an application to a point where it is determined one way or another. The decision has been made by the department that there is sufficient information available to get a quick decision in relation to that project. I would have thought that's in everyone in the community's interests to have a determination based on the clear advice of the department that they have sufficient evidence upon which a decision can now be made. I think that's in everyone's interests.
Minister, are you saying that you have no difficulty with an executive director of the Property Council of New South Wales being on temporary leave and being involved in stakeholder engagement on behalf of your department and the people of New South Wales in relation to a project that is being brought forward by a development corporation, in this case Mirvac, one of whom's representative is on the board of the Property Council of New South Wales? Are you saying that doesn't trouble you at all?
Again, Mr. Shippridge, there's been a very clear answer in relation to...
But I'm asking you, Minister.
Yes, and I'm providing my answer, which is you've heard clear evidence from from senior people within the department that there is no actual conflict of interest, and in relation to the bar that you seem to be putting, that would be almost impossible for the department to speak to anyone at any stage, because the nature of people with expertise in property and planning industries is at one stage or other they may have worked for someone involved in the system at some point along the way.
It would be impossible for anybody that had a position to go to with the Property Council of New South Wales to do it without a conflict of interest. You agree with that, don't you? Well, if you had a job you're going back to with the Property Council of Australia, New South Wales Division, if you had a job there, you would clearly have a conflict of interest.
Well, again,
and that's why you shouldn't have done it, Minister. Don't you understand?
Again, Chair, you've had the benefit of legal advice on this matter, and we've been told, the committee's been told there was no actual conflict of interest. So there is the answer to your question.
Mr. Hebron, did you provide written advice about the conflict of interest?
Well, can I intervene there to say that he's provided advice right now to the committee here.
Under oath.
Mr. Hebron, did you provide written advice to the department
you can
about
ask
the
questions
Minister,
through me, and straight away I will say, before I reflect to the chair and then through the chair to the secretary and then through the secretary to the General Counsel, you are getting advice. The committee's getting the advice of the benefit of advice under oath right now. So regardless as to what other advice Mr. Hebron has provided, he's provided his advice directly to you on the questions you've asked under oath right here, right now.
Minister, I ask again through you. Has written advice, he has not answered the question with all due respect, has written advice been provided?
I don't think that this line of questioning is going to get any further than we've already been down this path twice. So
all right.
I ask that you rule on your own question,
right.
if you're able to do so.
No, but I'm happy to do that. Your point of order is that I've asked it before and an answer has been provided.
Yes.
Yes, I note your point of order. I don't think there's a point of order on that.
What a surprise.
Isn't there a conflict of interest,
Minister, you are... I don't know why you won't ask Mr. Hebron whether or not he's given written advice. I can't understand why we're having this.
No, I'm just making the point. You can get the advice in writing if you want, but you've got it right now.
Better than this.
Have you provided written advice addressing this executive director of the Property Council who's on temporary secondment? Have you provided written advice addressing the actual or potential conflict of interest that has with his role for the department?
I'll need to take that on notice, sorry.
All right. Mr. Betts, is there any, are there any arrangements in place to ensure that if somebody such as this gentleman is going to have ongoing commercial or personal links, and by that I mean personal financial links to a proponent, to have that raised as a conflict of interest and to have someone step aside and not undertake duties where there's that conflict?
Mr. Power has a direct financial association with the proponent.
I beg your pardon?
Are you implying or stating that Mr. Power has a direct financial?
I am suggesting that given he's employed by the Property Council
he's actually
of
employed by
Australia,
me.
I want to be clear, Mr. Betts, given he's employed by the Property Council of Australia and would require the confidence of the board, that to the extent that board members of the Property Council have a financial interest in their projects, he has a pecuniary interest in that regard. And I'm wondering whether or not that's captured by your conflict of interest procedures, and if so, what, if any, pecuniary interests notifications he has provided.
Well, I have to take on notice what pecuniary interests he's provided. I just don't have that information to hand, other than to say it's standard practice for all public servants in New South Wales, of which Mr. Power is one, to provide declarations of interest. But the critical point here, which you appear to be missing, is that he is not involved in any determinative process, either in terms of the fast-tracking of individual projects or the determination of those projects. He is a professional stakeholder engagement person who is doing precisely that, and that is what I've asked him to do, and it doesn't create any conflict of interest.
The opposition.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Shoebridge was asking you about the West Pennant Hills project. I think it's the Mirvac site, formerly the IBM site, around that. And that's now been selected for fast track, notwithstanding there's a long history of local community and I think council opposition to the proposal. The public schools in that area, I think, are oversubscribed. That is, they're completely full, and I think I'm right that your government proposed a new hospital at Rouse Hill in 2015, and I don't think the site for that has even been acquired. So you've got the associated sort of public infrastructure around there in the form of schools and hospitals still lacking or not keeping pace with development. Is it appropriate to have selected that particular proposal for fast tracking when the supporting social and community infrastructure is still behind what even the current community needs?
Well, a couple of things here. First, I mean, it was selected on its basis, on the basis of the criteria, so it adhered to the criteria. But also, I mean, going back a step, the current site is, the totality of the site has I think it's a B6, it's a business zoning, it's a business park zoning.
Yeah,
So there's a whole range of permissible uses on the site right now. I understand the planning proposal proposes to convert quite a large proportion of the site to environmental conservation, so actually a lower intensity of development on that site than is currently permissible with consent at the moment. So that's just a point to make. Nevertheless, I do understand it's change of use and involving a change to residential use, which is always controversial. But my understanding is the business park at the moment is basically unused, and at a period when we need to effectively provide as many jobs as possible, we need to also be quite. I think that's another thing to take into account in looking at this matter. And I also stress at this point to say that this is merely being fast-tracked in order to facilitate a determination. That's not to say that it will necessarily be approved or necessarily be refused. It is just that all the evidence is there necessary to support a decision one way or the other.
Yeah.
And I don't, and I also, even though it was not my selection of that project in any sense, but I certainly don't see that the public interest is served by further delaying what will necessarily be a difficult decision one way or the other.
Yeah, don't misunderstand me. I think my perspective on the matter is a little bit different to Mr. Shoebridge's. I wasn't taking issue with the proposal for change of use, and nor necessarily with it becoming residential. It was more, obviously with residential you're going to increase population in the area, and the point I was trying to make and invite a response from you is that you need to have social and physical infrastructure to support communities, to help them have, better lifestyles. Obviously, intrinsic to that is health services and school services, and that area is already struggling with both of those because that form of infrastructure has not kept pace even with the existing population, and yet, this proposal would, in a 600 unit way, increase the population and pressures on those services. Shouldn't your fast tracking criteria include the need for supporting infrastructure? Shouldn't that also become a focus of the planning system so that you can have the accompanying supporting infrastructure at the same time as increased development?
And so the answer to that is all of the other processes continue in exactly the same way. So the decision maker would have to take into account whether or not they are satisfied that there is sufficient current or future infrastructure to support the development anticipated by that rezoning, and they would no doubt reflect on the state infrastructure strategy, on the relevant district plan, and the Greater Sydney Commission's plan, the Metro plan for Sydney, as well as the long-term transport master plan, and those sorts of things to identify the sorts of infrastructure that is available and will be available to support development on that site in informing their decision making.
Sure. And I guess one of the issues about the planning system, and I think all governments sort of struggle to deal with this, is, in a sense, it's proponent-led, isn't it? It's like you've got the planning rules in place and you're, in a sense, dependent on people to come forward with ideas. But the difficulty with that seems to be that often there's a lag in providing the necessary infrastructure. Do you have any plans, particularly in the current circumstances, of trying to get ahead of that curve to actually ensure that areas where there is proposed growth actually have this supporting infrastructure at the same time as growth is taking place? Well,
that's the holy grail of planning, and that's something the government has made big strides on. I would take a different view, respectfully. I think, for example,
I think we'll have a different view on that one.
But the three plans I spoke about, I mean, the state infrastructure strategy, the long-term transport master plan, and the metro strategy, were all delivered at the same time with the benefit of the same data sets for the first time in New South Wales history in 2018. And schools, for example, we have a 10-year plan which has never been provided in the past. So we are doing a lot more long-term planning and the identification of infrastructure necessary to support different levels of development. That's a big part of planning for contributions plans under Section 711 of the Planning Act and special infrastructure contributions, which is all about identifying both what infrastructure is required and a mechanism to pay for it as well. And that's a lot of the work, for example, the Greater Sydney Commission's been doing with its pilot project, for example, around the Parramatta to Olympic Peninsula, for example.
And I know the Productivity Commission is seized of the issue of developer contributions, I think, on referral from yourself.
So there's a lot of work going there. I mean, it is, it will always be with the best planning system in the world and an inexact science, because you don't quite know what the market is going to throw up in terms of ideas as to what people want to do with their land. And in a democratic planning system, of course, there will be direction from the state, but there's also opportunity for landowners to put forward the ideas that they have and for them to be considered in light of the infrastructure available to support it.
Yeah, but much of the infrastructure ultimately has traditionally been the responsibility of government to facilitate and provide.
Yeah, and if a proponent wants to do something quite different, then they take on more of a responsibility to provide the infrastructure that is identified as necessary to support that development.
But unfortunately, the end result of all of this, Minister, is the case where development goes ahead and communities don't have the infrastructure they need. They struggle, at least for some period of time. That's not desirable, is it?
No, and I guess the big lesson there would be Sydney into its third century, which was by then Planning Minister Bob Carr put out, which quite deliberately actually set out ex-urban areas like Rouse Hill at the time, with no public transport linking into the CBD. So, and a lot of this government's job has been to retrofit infrastructure like the metro, for example, to link up those areas where there was no provision for public transport made. And so they're the consequences of decisions made 30 years ago. We want to make sure that the decisions we make don't create similar problems in 30 years' time.
The Powering Sydney's Future project in Tranche 1 which was the Transgrid, I think the upgrade of the transmission system. The initial estimate, I think when you announced the fast tracking on 28 April, was that would create 70 jobs. And then sort of, again, within a matter of weeks, it's 140 jobs. Can you tell us what criteria was used to produce each of those two different evaluations?
I'll happily refer to the Secretary for more details.
I'll take that on notice if I may,
Okay.
rather than speculating. But if it's similar to Mount Druitt we were talking about earlier on,
Yeah.
the initial estimate, for instance, there we talked about was around 3,000. That was for construction only.
Mm-hmm.
And then we did more work to identify the ongoing employment impacts, which took that up to an aggregate of 15,000. Now, I suspect that a similar relationship may exist between the two figures that you just described, but I'll take that on notice and I'll come back to you.
And I'd also like to, particularly when it comes to the LEPs and the claimed financial impact and the jobs, to understand exactly how you've calculated that, because
Sure.
it does seem to be a little bit of a, I think, what did you describe it as, an iterative process?
Well, no, I
Seems to have
didn't
grown,
describe
is it
that as
not?
an iterative process, but I suspect what Jim has suggested is what we're talking about. One relates to construction, other relates to broader impacts of development. But we'll take on notice and get back to you.
Construction is obviously easier to calculate in the near term
I
than the
totally
long term.
understand that. But again, with the LEPs, again, what is your time frame for those estimates? In tranche 2 was the Tweed Valley Hospital Stage 2. It's had an interesting history in budget papers. In 17-18, it was described as a $534 million project. In the 1920 budget papers, it was a $582 million project, so it had gone up by 9% in a year or so without much happening in the intervening period of time. And in your fast-tracking announcement, it's described as a $673.2 million project. It's increased by $139 million, about a 26% uplift in the cost in just a few short years. And it's not even out of the planning process. Again, how are these cost estimates developed? Are you reliant on the proponent to give you their estimate, or is this an estimate developed by the planning department? Exactly, how much reliance can we place on these figures that are being...
So an applicant is required to put in a CIV, a capital investment value, to a project as part of a DA submission process for transparency. That is a defined term. I can refer to the Secretary for more detail in how a CIV is calculated. In relation to the difference with the budget papers, I can only speculate, but I imagine either the project has been augmented, or there are elements included in the development application that may not be identified in the budget paper. I can't speak to that, but again, nor is that my role. My role is to provide a system for the assessment of development applications, and here we're guided by the applicant in terms of what they indicate on their documentation is the capital investment value. I'm not sure if the Secretary has anything further to add.
Only to say that we provide guidance to them on how to go about the calculation of the capital investment value of their project, and it may be, again, from past experience, there are a number of different methodologies you can use around the way you build escalation, the way you define the scope of these projects. So it may be that it ends up being an apples and oranges comparison when you look at the CIV as specified in the planning system, as opposed to a figure which might appear in the budget papers, but I can't speak to the detail of that project.
Okay, well, a second example of this is the fish market project, which again, I think is in tranche 2. It also has an interesting history. In November 2016, it's described as a $250 million project. And then by September 2019, and now it's a $750 million project. It's tripled in price. Again, it's not out of the planning system. And from what I can see, the project seems to have shrunk in size from 35,000 square metres, or metres squared, to 30,000. So you seem to be getting slightly less for triple the price. Again, where do these figures come from? Again,
Point
are
of
they from the
order.
proponent, or are they from your department?
We have a point of order.
Order, Chair. Unless I'm confused, I think I'm in the COVID pandemic inquiry, not budget estimates, and I understand that we're asking about fast tracking of matters. My point of order is: does the question relate to the government's response to the COVID pandemic, or is it a general
I think because
request?
it's on the fast track list. I think then the fast track list was designed to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. I do think it fits within the terms of reference.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
Thank you. And access to fish is important at all times, including a pandemic. But look, I can only speculate, but I suspect the
That was a red herring.
We've just broadened the scope of the inquiry significantly, but press ahead.
So I just don't know what was what was the subject of what was being announced in those earlier announcements, as opposed to specifically the project that was being submitted for assessment. There is some clear guidance provided to applicants about exactly how to put together a CIV. So that figure would reflect the total investment value of the development for which approval is being sought. Whether that reflects the all of the amount that might be in a budget envelope, that's a different question. This relates specifically to the development for which approval is being sought, and precisely just those elements of it being sought in that application. That's its cost.
Okay, so we can expect the assessment to be done fairly quickly because it's in the fast track tranche. What concomitant obligation is there on those receiving these fast tracked approvals to then put those approvals shovel ready, as it were, into action on the ground? Is there a concomitant expectation or requirement that they get cracking?
Yes, one of the clear criteria is that physical commencement be within 6 months in relation to a DA, and in relation to a planning proposal that that DA be submitted within 6 months. But I'll refer to the Secretary for more details.
That's correct. I'll see if I can find in the documentation the precise reference to that. But we require our proponents to attest that they will bring forward construction in the context of a DA and a DA in the context of a rezoning in order to qualify under the shovel readiness criterion.
So again, just trying to understand, so taking both, to say, the Tweed Hospital or the fish markets, assuming one or both are approved, should we expect sort of this time next year to be seeing actual physical activity on those sites in terms of these two matters?
That would be my expectation, and that was the basis upon which they were selected for fast tracking. Indeed.
And they would have attested to that in the course of that process?
I wasn't engaged in that directly, but I'll refer to the Secretary. Yes, and he's indicating correct.
On the fish markets, they have to start construction within 6 months of the approval. That's the time frame for the fish markets, isn't it, Mr. Betts?
That's my understanding, yeah.
So we should be well and truly underway by this time next year.
Looking forward to it.
Oh, well, it'll be a matter for budget estimates next year. In relation to...
$1 billion fish markets project.
That's a lot of fish. The three education projects in Tranche 1 were all announced, I think, in 2018. The Alex Avenue Public School at Riverston, the new high school, library and community facility in Young, and the education and employment precinct at Meadowbank. Can you shed any light on why those essentially government projects have taken so long in the planning system? Maybe you could start with the schools one rather than the young one. I think it's got some particular winkles on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, with all of them, I mean, the first thing we need to identify is, casting back to my experience as Education Minister, the decision to build a new school is based on, on existing and projected future increases in enrolment. But then, of course, once the decision to build the school is made, there needs to then be a consultation process with the community, with the existing schools and surrounding schools, as well as the appointment, for example, for a new school of a new principal, a project control group, and then the appointment of architects and so on and so forth. Then there needs to be a public exhibition process, and all leading to the submission of plans, and then there need to be all the relevant approvals or concurrences, and ultimately that results in an application that's approved. So it's the same process for every school.
Sure.
Yeah.
But in relation to the Alex Avenue Public School, when it was announced, it was due to be completed by early 2021. So of the sort of 3-year life of the project, 2 years have been spent in the planning system. Again, Can you specifically shed any light on why this has taken so long to get through the planning system, one way or another? And is it still expected to be completed by early 2021, or because of that delay in the planning system, should it be expected to be completed later?
I've just received a note. I don't know specifically in relation to Alex Avenue yet, but in relation to Young, for example, that was only technically submitted in the planning system in November 2019. So there are a lot of pre-planning processes before it becomes a project, within the planning system.
Sure, and that's why I think I might have singled out the Young High School, and I think they had some particular difficulties or other features associated with it.
Okay, so I just point that one out because without access to the information, I'm not sure that they've been in the planning system for all of that time. In fact, I know they wouldn't have been. They would have been in the planning system some time after they were announced.
Okay.
And in relation to timings of school projects, I'd have to refer you to the Education Minister. But in relation to the assessment process for all of those, they've been fast-tracked and they've been determined.
I'd also recommend that you might want to look at the planning portal website, which provides all the documentation going from the initial request for Secretary's environmental assessment requirements through all the EIS documentation, submissions, response to submissions, all the processes the Minister's described, all documented there in full public view, including the assessment reports, the notice of decision, development consents and so on.
Oh, it's amazing how quickly the time goes.
It is. You've completed for the moment, Adam.
Over our heads with the timing.
Yes. Minister, was your department involved when Treasury wrote to, amongst other people, the Urban Task Force, asking for a list of shovel-ready projects that have been caught up in the New South Wales planning system? Was your department consulted by Treasury when they made that request?
Well, in my experience, Treasury work in mysterious ways.
Which is why me too, Minister, which is why I'm asking you.
So in relation to consultation, certainly I wasn't involved in that consultation process, but I will refer to Mr. Betts as to whether the department was engaged.
Fair to say that in the early stages of the pandemic, Treasury, very much in immediate response mode, it instigated a whole series of processes for engagement with the business community, and no doubt conversations took place at working level, not at secretary level, but at working level between the two agencies, as Treasury reached out to the business community and sought ideas and feedback on how the government could be responding. But that process was rapidly normalised after that, and we've spent some time today describing the process which my department is following to capture the projects which have been submitted from all kinds of different sources, including through New South Wales Treasury, to make sure that there's an ordered and probity-based process for their consideration.
So what happened to Treasury's process? Because Treasury wrote to, amongst other people, the Urban Task Force and got a list of...
which they gave to us.
Okay.
End of story.
So then they gave that list to you and all the associated paperwork, I assume?
There wasn't much associated paperwork, but yes. And so having received that list from Treasury and a range of other sources, including unsolicited material from proponents, we have gone through a process of attempting to sift that, to order it, and ultimately to begin the process of identifying which projects can be accelerated for consideration in accordance with the framework I've described.
Well, Mr. Betts, you say there wasn't much paperwork, but I have to hand the correspondence from the Urban Task Force to the Executive Director, one of the Executive Directors at Treasury of the 31st of March this year, writing with this further updated submission in response to your request for Urban Task Force members to provide a list of shovel-ready projects. And that was an 80-page document. Did you receive that?
I may well have received it. I was copied in on a great hail of correspondence from a range of different sources around that time, so I'm sure I did receive it. But 80 pages, to be honest, in the context of the planning system, is not very many pages.
Oh, no, you're pushing against an open door there, Mr. Betts. I fully understand that. If there were 80 attached PDFs, then perhaps we would have a lot of documents. But nevertheless, a substantial document, you'd agree, an 80-page submission from the Urban Task Force. It's a substantial
I've read
document.
80-page documents that are completely insubstantial, so I can't comment.
It's a semantic argument we don't need to address.
Okay.
But amongst those, the Urban Task Force said that they'd given a three-tier ranking system to their projects. Ranking A was projects which are currently stuck in the planning system, and if the problem identified was resolved or cleared, the project could be started within 6 months. Does that ring a bell?
It sounds plausible.
Can you advise the committee whether or not the Mirvac Kunara Avenue project was one of those ranking A projects from the Urban Task Force, and if so, what was the problem identified that they wanted resolved or cleared?
No, I can't. You've got a document in front of you that I don't have in front of me.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to give you the document, but I might ask you to take this on notice if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
To the extent that any of these projects are, well, first of all, could you provide on notice a full copy of the Urban Task Force correspondence, including the attachment?
Well, the document's the property of the Urban Task Force. I don't have a problem with it myself, but I would, as a courtesy, want to make sure that any correspondence they'd entered into, I'm providing to a parliamentary committee, that it doesn't contain commercially sensitive information that I may not be aware of. So I can't give you a blanket guarantee on
I'm only asking you to take this on notice, Mr. Betts, and I assumed you would want to take them on notice.
And also the other caveat I'd just add to that, we can only provide what Treasury has provided to us. So.
Yeah, but I'm running on the assumption, which I thought we'd established earlier, that it was likely to be with you. But I accept that if you haven't got it, you can't provide it.
Yeah.
Secondly, to the extent that any of those projects are on either the Tranche 1 or the Tranche 2, this Tranche 2 lists, given the need for public transparency on how they got there, would you provide at least the details, all of the material from the Urban Task Force on notice in relation to the Tranche 1 and Tranche 2 projects that are found also on the Urban Task Force list?
I've got no problem with that, subject to the arrangements the Minister's just described.
Yes, and I can indicate that the issues about commercial in confidence and transparency would have a different, I would suggest that there would be a different analysis in relation to those that have been placed on the list and are going through a process than those that haven't, which is why I ask you the question in 2 stages.
And very happy to provide that information. The only point of interpretation I think would be useful to add is I haven't seen the lists, but I would suspect that that you would find that different stakeholder groups, including proponents themselves and maybe even councils, have nominated the same projects. So you might actually find a great deal of crossover. Potentially a project that the Urban Task Force might have said, here's a good one, might have also been put up by the UDIA or some other group as well.
Yeah, but the Urban Task Force had a good hit rate. I think 8 of the 24 projects in the latest tranche were also on the Urban Task Force list.
If you submit an 80-page document, which is a list of projects, then you're casting the net fairly wide. The critical point that I would make is that whilst the Urban Task Force and its members and others who submitted proposals through the Urban Task Force may have had views on where those projects were at and what the obstacles might be, the department's process was a de novo process. We looked at that on its merits in accordance with our criteria and without in any way being pejorative, took nothing on trust. That was very much the framework that we were operating within to apply our own criteria.
Now, Treasury requested a list of shovel-ready projects from the Urban Task Force, but to your knowledge, has either Treasury or your department also approached organisations such as NCOS or social and affordable housing providers to see if they had lists of shovel-ready projects?
I'll repeat. We've the COVID-19 stakeholder, or COVID-19 response stakeholder team led by Will Power has undertaken meetings with over 34 different stakeholder groups. We've had webinars with local government. We've met with, obviously, the peak development bodies, as we've discussed, local government New South Wales, retail and logistics bodies, people in the agriculture sector, mining sector, but also community and environment bodies. So we've had 4 webinars with local government. We've received 300 emails through the team inbox, 350 items of correspondence. So The reason why we brought Mr Power on in part is to enable us to reach out to as many stakeholder groups as possible. If you're aware of any stakeholder groups who have proposals that they would like to submit to us, then we'd be more than happy to receive.
And I'd like to add to that too, Mr Chair, that certainly a group like NCOS or someone, an affordable housing body, for example, would rate very highly in relation to the community benefits criteria. So I'd encourage them to put in.
Minister, you were preaching at the converted on the sense of reaching out to NCOS or other social and affordable housing providers, but from the list provided by Mr Betts, it appears that Mr Power hasn't done that.
That's
And
not
can
correct.
you? Well,
No,
I did not hear
including
either NCOS or any reference to social and affordable housing providers in the list that you
Community and
provided.
environment bodies were mentioned.
They absolutely were, and I'm in regular correspondence with NCOS on a range of different matters, so there is
Well-
no inhibition on talking to those groups. Or then
Did Mr Power reach out to NCOS and did Mr Power reach out to any social and affordable housing providers?
I'll take that on notice, but I'd be surprised if he hadn't.
Well, I note you're surprised, but we'll get an answer on notice.
Yeah, sure.
Mr Betts. Are there any proposals for low and middle income households or social Are there any proposals for public or social housing in the tranche 1 or tranche 2
Yes.
projects that are going to be shovel ready being constructed within the next 6 months?
That commence construction, I'd have to take that on notice, but certainly the Ivanhoe estate was a very big application in tranche 1, and it would have to have met the criteria in relation to shovel readiness.
Plus, since this is an inquiry into DPI's more general response to COVID in other parts of the portfolio, stimulus packages being provided to Land and Housing Corporation, Aboriginal Housing Office as well.
All right. Well, could you identify, Minister, on notice, those social and public housing projects, and when the expected housing will come on track under any of tranche 1 or tranche 2, and if Mr Betts is aware of any other projects that have been fast-tracked,
Yep,
could they be provided on notice, including the housing units?
Sure. Yep. Absolutely.
Minister, and maybe this goes best to Mr Betts, is one of the reasons why the cost of the fish market project has ballooned from $250 million to $750 million project, is that by reason of the inclusion of the Blackwattle Bay revitalisation element in the project, which is, I think, some 45-storey apartment blocks? Is that why the project has increased in scope, Mr Betts?
Hang on. So I think you're referring, to an INSW application for.
Well, you may tell me they're unrelated.
Yes, I think that's the answer.
Right.
And I'll refer to.
I see there's some vigorous nodding coming from behind
Vigorous
Mr
nodding.
Betts.
Right, vigorous nodding in the sense that it is absolutely a matter for Infrastructure New South Wales to answer that question, as the proponent for the project.
All right, but are they?
I'm not in a position to provide you with a detailed history of the evolution of the headline cost for that project, what's included, what's not included, what's net, what's gross. I think that's a question best directed to the proponent.
But my question was whether or not the project had expanded in scope to include 45-storey apartment blocks. That is not your understanding.
The fish market.
Well, to the extent that they are running as adjoining projects, is one of the reasons why the Blackwattle Bay revitalisation project has come online with the very large yield proposed there. Is that intended to recoup some of the ballooning costs for the fish market project to make if I could say the precinct cost less of a cost drain on the government?
So I can only answer in relation to the planning system, but what I can say is the application that came before us to assess was for a fish market. That obviously from INSW's perspective is related to what to do with the site of the current fish market. Clearly you can't do anything with the current fish market until you've moved it to the new site. As to what their plans might be on the new site is a matter for them. Presumably at some point it'll come to the planning system and then we will deal with it when it comes to us.
Minister, I think you made the order in relation to the construction work
Yes.
outside of the ordinary construction hours. Did you consult with local government before you made that order?
In relation to consultation, this was in the very early days of response. I will take it on notice as to consultation. I can't recall off the top of my head.
Have you had any representations to your office from local council since the making of the order?
It's interesting. So I've monitored this one because this was obviously, one of those areas where obviously we needed to do everything we can to support the construction industry, but this is one of those areas where it can have, if not properly controlled, negative impacts on the amenity of suburban areas. So this was one that I kept a very careful watching brief on. I think it's fair to say that there was a lot of concern to begin with of what might happen if applicants or developers behaved inappropriately or irresponsible with the extra construction hours that were available to them. So we did have complaints early on in relation to concerns of what might happen. I'm pleased to say since then we've had, and I'm happy to get further information on notice, but I understand there has not been significant complaint in relation to noise at construction site. So I need to be, I'm grateful to the team within DPI in terms of the drafting of the order and also the concurrence role from health, who pointed out things like, for example, we should limit it to things like sheet cutting and pile driving should be excluded from being included in works on weekends, and also that all reasonable efforts must be made to mitigate noise. So far, that seems to have operated successfully, and developers have been responsible with this extra flexibility they have. And I've got to stress again that the advice I received was it would have been impossible in several cases for developers to have met with the social distancing requirements and been able to continue work on their work sites. And this enabled things like some trades to work on weekends to allow that social distancing to occur.
Minister, are you aware of the concerns, a significant number of which arise from the WestConnex project, which has seen 24/7 construction, and as a result of which a number of residents have been effectively moved from their home and put up in hotels by reason of the 24/7 construction? Are you aware of those concerns?
Well, again, I'm talking across the whole state. If you have concerns, and if residents have concerns, of course they should raise them in the first instance with their local council, and then appropriately with the department. And if the order-making power can be varied, and if I'm convinced that this is being misused, particularly in relation to a particular site, for example, in the first instance we would talk with a developer and take appropriate action as required. In relation to that particular project, I'm advised that the 24-hour, 7-day construction is an order in the consent. It does not relate to the order under 10.17 of the Act.
Have you sought feedback from councils about the impact of the order?
Yeah, I have. So I had a webinar with Local Government New South Wales, and I sort of suggested, if people have concerns, by all means, they should raise them with the department. And to this date, it seems that those orders have been used responsibly by developers. I mean, we are in a different world, and there has to be a bit of give and take. But it seems, from my observations, that that those orders have worked quite successfully, and certainly I know that the construction industry is enormously grateful because it allows them to effectively keep up to 400,000 people in work.
Minister, I think there's agreement that some flexibility is required. The question is monitoring it to the extent that it's having a significant adverse impact on people's health and amenity. And your position is they should first contact their council, and then if that doesn't resolve, they should then contact your office or your department. Is that the position?
No, my position is absolutely, in relation to noise complaints, council is the appropriate body to contact, and of course the council can then escalate things with the department as necessary. I wouldn't, I don't think it's reasonable for a resident to have to complain to a council and then the council not do anything, so have to bring it up with us. I'd much prefer for councils to be proactive, and if they have concerns that they can't resolve, by all means raise it with the department.
Minister, if I could quickly go back to the Tranche 1, Tranche 2 fast-tracking projects. There are two projects in the second tranche where there's very substantial community opposition and indeed majority opposition on council. And one of them we've spoken about before, the Mirvac Kunara Avenue proposal. But the other one is the Crown East Lakes development, which is, I think, with Bayside Council. Did council opposition and community opposition, was it any part of the assessment of a project for being included or excluded on the fast track?
It's certainly a relevant consideration in the assessment and determination of the project, but it's not a relevant consideration in whether it's fast-tracked in terms of its determination. And Chair, I submit that this works both ways, because I think to leave a project in the system because there's opposition to it doesn't actually help anyone. Surely the best thing from the perspective of everyone in the community is to bring a process to a conclusion as quickly as possible to achieve an outcome and a determination one way or another. On both of those projects you've nominated, its inclusion in Tranche 2 does not indicate that it will necessarily be approved, and certainly does not suggest it would not be approved without condition. I frankly have no idea of what the determination outcome will be on either of those projects, which is absolutely appropriate. My interest is to make sure that they are processed as quickly as possible so that everyone can move on with their lives one way or the other.
Well, Minister, I mean, that's nice, but in effect, you revived the Mirvac Kunara Road project, or your department did. I think its time under their gateway approval had expired in January. It was literally picked up and revived. So far from rapidly determining something, you've actually revived it and put it back on life support in the system. Do you accept that?
No, I don't. Again, this was not about reviving applications. This was just about taking applications out of a sort of, a limbo, as it were, which doesn't help anyone in the community. And certainly that site has remained vacant all this time, and there's great uncertainty and stress for everyone in the community to allow it to be determined one way or the other.
Well, we'll come back to limbo and zombie DAs later. Mr. Graham.
Great. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. On Monday, on the 1st of June, a range of changes will take effect to allow venues to open, a whole range of venues, restaurants, pubs and clubs.
Bacchanalian future venues.
Will you be required to make or amend any ministerial order as those changes come through?
Not to my knowledge. Again, my order-making power under Section 10.17 of the Act relates to orders for the health, well-being or safety. Of citizens in New South Wales. It gives me a power that I can only exercise, obviously with the concurrence of the Health Minister, but I have not been approached to exercise this power, and nor do I see in what's been proposed.
So you have made one ministerial order in relation to takeaway food and beverages, but that, for instance, that order won't change?
No.
Yeah, okay. No. And have you been consulted about the changes that will take place for the 1st of June?
There are cabinet processes that I can't comment on.
Yeah, no worries. Obviously those changes haven't happened yet. We're here on the Friday afternoon ahead of Monday when all these venues will open. There is not a public health order. There are not guidelines for those businesses. We're very close to them opening their doors. Do you know when that will happen?
Again, I'd have to direct you to the responsible portfolio minister.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Minister. I wanted to ask about the Treasurer's enthusiasm for outdoor dining. He's floated some changes at this moment that might help with the current situation, and those have been flagged publicly. Obviously, this is something that state politics is often turned to. It's almost a seasonal enthusiasm that people will turn to the hope for European-style dining. There's a range of restrictions though that are in place to make this happen. There's the government outdoor dining policy says there's at least 5 permits required. Are you taking any steps to put this into action? What changes will be made to put the Treasurer's publicly announced view into action?
Well, Sydney's named after Dionysus, so it's it's absolutely appropriate that we look toward outdoor dining. But look, a number of things that we've already done. I'll point you to the Streets as Shared Spaces initiative, for example, which provides a grant opportunity for councils to look at things like outdoor dining and social distancing around pavements, shutting down streets, for example, where it's safe to do so, to allow shops to spill out. I point you to the orders in relation to dark kitchens and food trucks, which is all part of the same initiative, and we're also looking at other things that we might be able to do in the future.
Yes, I've looked at those measures. I mean, they don't directly address the sort of number of permits, the number of levels of approval that have to happen here. Really, I'm looking to get some, I mean, this is a welcome view from the Treasurer. Do you really think this is going to make any difference? What will you be making changes to any of these permits that are required in the way the Treasurer is suggesting?
Yeah, so the other, I mean, there are parts of permitting that don't relate to the planning system, that relate to licensing and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So I can't comment on those. But what I can say, I mean, also we are looking actively, for example, at the code SEP, so to what activities might usefully, for example, be included in categories of exempt development. But that's at an early level, an early level of consideration at this stage.
Yeah.
But there's been a number of things that we've done, and we're currently consulting to see if the code SEP, for example, might provide a venue.
That's really a long-term process. That's not going to help in this current crisis, is it?
No. I mean, we've been moving pretty quickly. So
that might be up for consideration as part of this.
Yes, although I don't want to get the committee too overexcited. We're at an early stage of consultation. No, the Treasurer, he's like he's an alfresco kind of guy, Don. So and I share his passion and enthusiasm for outdoor dining, and that's why we're very keen to support in whatever way we can as the planning system.
Yeah, but so if you're saying it might be relevant, you're saying that could be dealt with this year, possibly over the course of months rather than.
Yeah, we're in a new world in relation to the speed at which these sorts of things can be considered. But again, always in planning, you've got to be sort of Janus. You look both ways because you can have unintended consequences to announcements. So that's why we have to be careful to make sure that, exempt, we know, for example, complying development has created some challenges for communities. And so before we look to expand categories, we need to be very mindful of what the wider consequences can be. But I also think, historically we've been very bureaucratic about some of these things. I mean, you go to Europe, for example, and the local car park turns into a market square on a Saturday morning.
Sure.
There are things that we could usefully look at to open up trade and commerce at a local level.
Yeah, and the Treasurer has indicated he's raised this with you directly. I assume that's the case.
Yes.
Good. Yeah. He runs through a number of measures. I'll ask you just to confirm these are on the table. So lifting restrictions on businesses could be in the form of giving them more space on footpaths, allowing pop-up shops or markets to operate in public spaces such as parks. They're the sorts of measures that you're already moving on or considering, is that right?
Yes.
Yep. Very good. And what do you see this as being possible within the timeframes we're talking about? Is this, these are largely, many of the permits which were referred to in the New South Wales policy really sit with councils, not with the state government. What steps are you planning to take which will speed this up in reality, other than in the public discussion, given how much of a say councils have in this area?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, one of the great ways we can work with councils is through funding initiatives, and that's what the Streets as Shared Spaces is directed toward. And so those applications close on the 10th of June and will be assessed very smartly thereafter. So that's one clear initiative that will go towards helping to achieve the Treasurer's vision. But also, some of these orders go down that path in any event. And if there can be any applicable changes to the Codes SEP, for example, that would have a direct benefit. But you're quite right. Many of these outdoor areas are in the control of Council, but we'll work constructively with Council if they identify any barriers. My door's very open to look at how we can resolve them. But as I mentioned, there's that funding on the table directly for these sorts of initiatives.
Yeah. As you outline that process, it just sounds like it's slipping further away, Minister. But
No.
I'll ask you specifically about the 5 permits that are currently required, and also the liquor licence. They're set out in the policy. Do you see some of those being removed, or are you looking at those steps as well?
It's not for me to speculate on other people's portfolios, so I won't go down that path. But what I will say, you mentioned that the timelines seem to be slipping away. No, we're quite tight in terms of timeframes. I mentioned that grant funding, for example. Yeah. That's pretty quick. That's only a few
I do
more
want
days.
to come back. I do want to come back to that. The Treasurer is talking about dining, sitting down and eating. What's not under consideration is holding events, having music back, for example. That could be part of the answer to social distancing at the moment, couldn't it? Allowing some of these venues to actually hold events outside more easily, not just dining, this additional step, allowing social distancing right at the moment.
It could well be, but I presume that for most of those things you wouldn't require development consent in any event, so that they're not matters that would necessarily fall within the planning portfolio. It would not be matters that would necessarily come across my desk. It really depends the nature of the events. Generally, to be engaged in the planning system, there has to be a form of development envisaged, and here most of these wouldn't. I assume don't involve development as defined by the Act.
Yeah, many of these restrictions might be contained, though, in the original approval. That could certainly be the case.
Yeah, well, I'm not looking at retrospectively changing approvals. That's not, I want to be clear about that. But certainly an applicant at any point in time can put in a modification and seek to have an approval change, and that'll be determined in the ordinary course. To date, I'm not aware of that
Again,
happening.
that sounds like a very lengthy process, yep. Minister. Yeah. Yep. No, very good. Okay, thank you. I'll turn to the views you've just put about this program that you have announced. You've said that you've taken, you've opened this process already. This is the process of developing shared streets, footpaths, potentially bike lanes. That closes on the 10th of June for applications. Some of this has already started, particularly with the City of Sydney, though. Can you just tell us how much activity have you got already underway with the City of Sydney?
Sorry, can you be a little more specific? I don't know quite what you mean, sorry.
So I'm asking specifically here about the bike lanes announcement that the government's made, both in relation to, really in relation to temporary bike lanes.
Sure. So, there's a number of things that we've done in relation to working with the city in relation to bike lanes. Some of that will become clear into the near future, but certainly there's been the permanent closure for traffic for the George Precinct City down to I think it's down to Lee Street from Bathurst. Campbell Street, sorry. And then we've also got work at Parramatta Park, for example, on the People's Loop, but in the city specifically. Can I refer to?
Well, you've sort of headed towards one of the.
Yeah. Sorry. And I just wanted to refer with my colleague for a moment. We've also just concluded an order in relation to setting up temporary cycleways, again, in the interests of the health, safety and wellbeing of the community, on Pitt Street from King Street to Ryby Place,
Yep.
Henderson Road, Everleigh, Dunning Avenue, Rosebery, Moore Park Road to Fitzroy Street, Bridge Road, Glebe, and Sydney Park Road in Erskineville. So,
So they're in the City of Sydney. Are you working with other councils ahead of that 10th of June date to get things in place, or are things, or is this on hold until the rest of the projects come through after the 10th of June?
no, we'll happily work with councils at any stage.
But have you
here-
now? I've seen the City of Sydney announcements. Have you announced anything else?
In relation to other councils, I'll take that on notice in terms of negotiations with other councils, in terms of cycleways that they might like to establish.
And this is a $15 million fund, which has got to do a lot of work. It's meant to allow shared streets. It's meant to bring bike paths. There's plenty of things. It's about public spaces. There's plenty of things to do and not much money to do it. Do you see this?
Certainly a lot of money from my budget. So everything's relative, but
Sure.
and this is because I'm really trying to. I see that there is an opportunity to seize here, to actually reshape a little bit the way in which people get around the city, but also because the implications from COVID are going to be long term. As far as we are aware, social distancing will become a feature of city life, and so we need to prepare for that. But the $15 million should only also be seen as a leveraging amount as well. There's nothing to stop councils adding in extra money, and in
understood.
fact we encourage them to do so. But also we've also facilitated, for example, through the extension to the loan facility for councils of an extra $250 million. There's some, we'd encourage them to dip into that, as well as, for example, the changes to contributions plans to allow pooling, for example, and changes to timing of contributions plans for things like cycleways, pedestrian paths. All of that can potentially be brought forward and pooled with this other money.
It is a large amount of money for your portfolio. Where did the money come from?
From within the portfolio, I can refer you to the Secretary in relation to in relation to how that money was brought together.
Yeah.
As Minister said, it's reprioritisation within the existing portfolio. I'd need to check exactly where that came from. I suspect there was some underutilised funds elsewhere. And as we approach the end of the financial year, we're only less than a couple of weeks away from being able to award this.
Understood. And did any of it come from the Road Safety Fund, given the emphasis on road safety and so on?
That's not within my portfolio.
Yeah. That's why I ask.
Yeah. Oh, look,
I don't know.
no, so this was an initiative within the DPIPE portfolio. But, for example, the Metropolitan Green Space grants would have been a source of funding, for example.
Okay. You haven't set aside any of the approvals that are required. So if someone puts in a grant, it does not negate the need for council or the proponent to attain all necessary required approvals, such as road changes or traffic facilities under the Roads Act. Again, a lot of bright ideas here. They almost never happen. Why is this going to be any different?
Firstly, because there's a great deal of, I will be taking a personal interest to make sure that things are moved along. We also have a Transport for New South Wales embedded in the grant assessment team, as I understand.
Yes.
And so, they will be, and also with councils, I mean, as many local members would know, local traffic committees, work over time to identify projects that are supportable, but they may not have funding to get them off the ground. So I suspect
so say a road is changed here, will that have to go through the traffic committee process, or will you set that aside?
We're not. I don't have power to set aside processes in other legislation, and also. Obviously, there's a paramount concern on road safety here.
Sure.
I mean, we want to encourage
it's one of the
innovation,
goals of
but
this.
safety has to
So
come
none of the
first.
approvals set aside, the traffic committee process will operate potentially as normal.
That's my understanding, but I'll refer to...
It's a process whereby councils are offering up proposals for consideration, so they have an interest in getting these proposals up, and we would certainly want to work with them in partnership to identify whether we could assist them in fast-tracking these things through their processes.
Are you concerned, Minister, that many of these projects just won't happen in the relevant period? I mean, people are at home now need places to go now, need places to social distance now, if they hear this is going to be the subject of a rolling traffic committee discussion, that may not give them much hope that anything will come out the other end.
Well, no,
is that one of your concerns?
Look, I mean, I'm concerned about a lot of things, but this is, I think we're in a period now where ordinary processes are absolutely, we obviously need to follow all existing procedural requirements, but that doesn't mean that those processes need to be slow, and that's, I think, effectively what we're demonstrating through the Planning System Acceleration Program. It's not about truncating process or missing out process, it's about doing what we already do faster and reprioritising resources to get results quicker. Exactly the same here.
Yeah.
And in relation to a lot of these projects, I imagine there would be, let's see what comes through, but I imagine there'd be quite a lot that has already been endorsed or capable of being endorsed by traffic committees that could get off the ground quite quickly.
One of the consequences of the physical distancing on public transport is many more people may be on our roads. That hasn't taken effect yet, mainly because people are working out of the city or staying at home. It will be a factor. We just don't know when. How, given what we're facing, given the sheer number of people, 1.7 million people off public transport, potentially onto our roads, how do you plan to deal with these shared streets initiatives, given that volume of cars tipping onto the road, given the public transport issues?
Well, straight away, this is dealing, my understanding, not with state roads. So no, we're not dealing with major arterial routes here in any event. But also, in just the same way as we're expecting more private motor vehicular traffic, we're also expecting more pedestrian traffic over the same period as well. So while there might be an exodus from public transport, that will go into, yes, motor vehicle traffic, but also into active transport as well. So we will need more bike lanes and we will need more footpaths over the same period.
I'll turn to the question my colleague was asking about the orders you've made for infrastructure construction through your ministerial order around the clock over the course of the week. When do you expect that at the moment to be revoked? How long do you see that being in place?
So the orders have been made for a prescribed period, calibrated, I understand, with a health order, and 6 months from when it was made.
Exactly. So you see that as just travelling with the health order. As the health order changes, at the end of that prescribed period, you'd see it finishing then. Have you given any consideration to uncoupling that from the prescribed order?
A day is like 1,000 years at the moment. I literally can't. I can't answer your question because I just don't know where this pandemic is going. But we will keep a watching brief on that. But we certainly have not developed any long-term plans to, for example, implement it as a permanent fixture of the planning system or anything like that. And if we were to consider anything like that, of course we would come and talk to you all about it.
Thank you.
I think the honourable member should perhaps disclose his conflict of interest as a cyclist. And, so
Yes,
it would be
I think you needed to make the Lycra declaration at the beginning of that job.
It would be a Herculean effort to get all the councils to coordinate bike lanes in every area.
I'm happy to declare a conflict of interest in relation to cycling, but not to Lycra.
Well, I'm going to make the same conflict of interest in relation to cycling, but also say at this stage, not yet Lycra.
Not ruling it out.
We all go through that ageing process where the Lycra seems to be essential. Minister, given the infrastructure...
I was going to say I wear a lot of Lycra but don't do a lot of cycling, but that would be...
We'd be talking about vanity projects then, wouldn't we?
Given that as I understand it, this cycling infrastructure is going to be approved under your powers under 10.17, is that the intent?
Not the infrastructure, pardon me, that's the orders for allowing for the temporary cycleways, not the streets as shared spaces.
Okay, yes, so I'm sort of talking about the cycleways.
Pardon
so
me, yes.
The infrastructure for the cycleways will be put in place under 10.17.
Yes, that's my understanding.
And that's time limited?
That's my understanding, yes.
Is there any work being undertaken to allow for that infrastructure if it becomes popular and useful to be extended beyond the pandemic period?
I think there is every opportunity for us to consider that. I mean, it's only been made today, so let's see how the public responds and see how useful it is. Of course, this is a period where we can experiment, do innovative ideas, and if they work, I see no reason as to why we can't implement them on a permanent basis. But at this stage, the orders are time limited.
All right. And at this stage, apart from the City of Sydney, have any other councils identified projects?
Not for the purposes of requiring orders at this stage, as far as I'm aware.
And is the funding contingent upon the projects requiring orders, or is the funding simply for any cycleway project?
The Streets as Shared Spaces program is not in any way tied to the orders.
Okay. But the entirety of that program is $15 million?
That's correct. But of course, using it wisely, we can leverage a much greater amount of money.
Yes, and perhaps bringing forward projects that have not quite hit the funding level in a local council.
Yes, indeed.
Is the pooling of developer contributions provisions going to be a potential source for funding of those kinds of infrastructure projects?
Of course, it obviously relates to what's in those infrastructure, in those contribution plans. But in many contribution plans, there are cycleways included, so there's no reason as to why they couldn't be included potentially.
Minister, there has been some concern amongst some parts of the local council sector about those changes and about it potentially allowing you to reach into developer contribution pools by local councils. Can you explain to the committee what the protocols you're intending to establish are or have established before you will exercise any of those powers?
So we are currently working with Local Government New South Wales as to what that might look like. As to what that might look like. Look, I can at one level I can understand the concerns of councils, but my message to them is, well, then get the money out the door. If you're sitting on vast amounts of infrastructure dollars that can be usefully used in supporting your council employees and providing a context for appropriate development, then do it. And that's what we want to do. But this is all about where the pots of money in various ledger accounts aren't sufficient to do anything in particular. If you could pool it, maybe you could do something that would meet those objectives. I'm not sure if the Secretary had anything further to add there.
Simply that one of the criticisms is that the provision of infrastructure, including cycling infrastructure, public open space that we've talked about, often fails to keep pace with development. This is an opportunity to free that up and make sure that arbitrary rules within the development contributions regime don't stand in the way of councils being able to move rapidly to provide popular infrastructure.
Yeah, well, Minister, I supported the changes because actually many councils, another part of the local government sector, have repeatedly said there are too many strictures on development contributions, and they can often sit on funds for a decade or more, waiting for them to hit critical mass. Has this power been exercised at all?
Not as yet, no.
Has any council approached you for the exercise of the powers?
I'd have to take that on notice.
And will there be a public notification process, either before the powers are exercised or during the consideration of
I
them?
would have nothing to hide, so I'd be very happy to make whatever declarations is necessary should and when the time to raise that power arise.
All right.
To use that power arise.
Minister, you're aware of the controversy concerning the situation down at Manana.
Certainly am.
And I know you've expressed on the record that it wouldn't be a planning decision you would have made to zone the land as it currently is.
Having said that, it's tricky because it was permissible with consent. So, you know, the fundamental problem here was the underlying zoning that made that decision permissible. That was the trick.
Yes, and I think that's the decision that you say you would, in hindsight, would not have.
I don't want to be unfair to the minister at the time. I mean, I didn't have the same powers that he had at the time, but I wasn't in his shoes, so I don't know what he was looking at. Certainly, when I've seen the subdivision plan, it looks like something that, would be from Porpoise Spit in the 1960s. It's a shocking subdivision.
Yes. Yeah, well, you're pushing against an open door on that, Minister. You sent officials down over the last few weeks to investigate whether or not breaches had been occurring. What was the result of those investigations?
I'll refer to the Secretary.
I'll have to take that on notice, I'm afraid. I know we're monitoring compliance very strictly. I'll see if I can source the information for you now and might come back to you.
Thanks,
But I'm
Mr.
happy to say to the committee now, if there's evidence of any breaches, we will take swift action in relation to that.
And I have
Told no breaches to date.
no breaches to date. Minister, given that there's only stage 1 approval, how is it the proponent has been able to fence the entire site, which incorporates well beyond the proposed stage 1 approval?
As that, I suspect, will relate to legal matters, I'll refer you to the Secretary if he can provide any light on it. I assume we're going to have to take that on notice.
Minister, one of the options for resolving the issue is for it to be acquired either by the state, hopefully by the federal government, I think we could all agree on that, or by a mixture of state, local and community funding. Has your department commenced undertaking an independent valuation of the site?
No, and the short answer is, here, a negotiation with a local developer, it's important that we're all not negotiating with the developer at the same time. Those negotiations commenced with Counsel. Counsel approached me for the state to acquire the site. I wrote back to them earlier this week and said, well, great, we're happy to look at it. How much do you want? So that we could, get a sense of what quantum was sought. To date, I don't know if I've received a reply. I wouldn't anticipate yet because it's been very quick. But ultimately, there can be too many cooks in a negotiation. Ultimately, this is, while it's significant bushland and strategic, no doubt, it is not it is. I would not assess this, not in any way diminishing its importance, but it is more of a locally important bushland than a state significant bushland, I would say. So the acquisition authority and certainly who would manage it, I would anticipate would most likely be Council. So we'd be very pleased to participate in any negotiation, but I don't have an endless bucket of money either, and I know that Council doesn't either. So it would, I'd be very keen to look at some sort of collaborative funding solution, and also involving the federal government. I also don't want to say anything or do anything that might boost any potential.
I think this entire exchange is in the context that there may well be commercial matters that need to be respected. I accept that. But Minister, given the far greater depth of expertise and resources that the state government has when it comes to acquiring parcels of land than the local council.
Get stuck into us when we acquire land.
No, I don't. I get stuck into you when you do it on behalf of developers and you change the law to allow that to happen. But apart from that, no. Given the far greater resources and capacity the state government has to go through the acquisition process, would you be willing to review whether or not the state government takes the lead role in an acquisition process, albeit in conjunction with the council,
Point of order,
for the Manana site?
We have had the first question. I sat back quietly and listened to that. I'm just interested in how this is COVID, government response to COVID related, and whether we could bring it back to that topic.
Yes, one of the arguments. I'll respond. It's one of the arguments being put for the developer is that it's important to have this development happen rapidly because of the COVID-19 concern, loss of development on the south coast. So I accept it's a tangential point, and I accept that.
Very hard
and I will wrap up this line of questioning given its tangential point, if that's okay with you.
It's all great
Ms.
to me,
Ward.
but
Yes.
Okay, no, I was just enjoying that because I actually agree with that point of order. But nevertheless, I take you on the chair.
You should chair it then.
I'm not a member
And
of the
again,
upper
raise my
house.
issue with the conflict.
No, yeah.
Look, again, I think, I'm happy to consider that and get back to you on notice, I think. But at this stage, I think the council has been negotiating with the developer to this point. They have all the relationships, all the knowledge. We're happy to work with council, happy to support council, but I don't think it would be useful at this stage to get another party involved. Ordinarily, when these things happen, negotiations are done by councils and the state is then approached to provide some support. I would assume that would be the ordinary course of things to occur, but I'm happy to consider it on notice and consider it quickly as well because I know time is of the essence.
And if council asks it of you, you don't have a closed door, you'll consider that.
I'm happy to. Yes, I'm happy to consider things, obviously, but I need to put it on the record that I don't have I don't have a limitless bucket of funds, and I also have to look at acquiring land for public purposes right across New South Wales, and so there are many competing demands on my budget, and so it would obviously come with the very significant caveat that council would need to be prepared to be invested themselves.
Yes. Minister, given the nature of this inquiry, I won't go at length into the extraordinary environmental values of the land and why it would have state significance. That's perhaps for another place.
When I say that,
That's perhaps for another place.
That's more, there is a process, for example, if it met the requirements for acquisition in a national park estate, that's more what I was considering, and by all means that might be a route to consider, but I'm not sure that it would meet those values necessarily.
All right. Well, then the last thing I'll ask is, will you ask your department to consider whether or not they're in a position to undertake such an assessment, or to commence such an assessment being undertaken by the state government?
Well, David, again, I renew my objection to the question. We've gone down this path where we really are straying very far away from the terms.
And I accept the strength of your submission, so which is why this is my last question on the point.
I'm happy to ask. I think it's more a matter for ESS than for planning to do specifically, but I'm also aware that ultimately there is a consent that has been given. Our role is to make sure that is not to inquire as to whether the consent should have been given or not. That's sort of something beyond our capacity to look at. Nevertheless, it's there, and our job is to make sure that the terms of the consent are adhered to. I would presume, in fact, I'm sure that an environmental assessment of the values of the land were conducted as part of the assessment, as the original assessment, to inform the decision. But nonetheless, I'm happy to inquire of the department whether, for example, ESS might be able to look at those values and whether it might, in that extent, to that extent, qualify for potential acquisition by the Parks Authority. I'm just hazarding a view that I suspect it probably doesn't, but I'm happy to ask the question.
All right. Thank you.
And I say that I know the area well.
Yes. And noting, I think, the merits of Ms Ward's objection, we will move on to another matter. Minister, we've now had tranche 1 and tranche 2 of fast-track assessments. Will there be a tranche 3? Will there be a tranche 4? Will there be an end to this?
Well, at this stage, no. There will be a tranche 3. Ultimately, I can't answer will there be an end to it because there are a certain number of projects that have been identified. Some of them will meet the merit, some won't. Presumably, other projects may also be identified as being worth considering for fast tracking. I'm certainly not opposed to continuing this process, but it depends on the pipeline of projects coming in, and it also depends on the length of the pandemic and a whole range of things beyond my control.
Minister, given that the pandemic has already had a significant impact on reducing Sydney's population growth, and that's likely to continue for a substantial period of time, how can we, well, some have critiqued the fast tracking process by just simply switching activity from site A to site B as opposed to increasing activity, because there's a dampening effect across the economy. How have you ensured that this isn't just picking favourites rather than actually improving or increasing economic activity?
Because of the criteria. The criteria was established deliberately to ensure that there was some rigour and transparency about the selection of projects. I'm open to refining that criteria into the future, but it was a good place to start. It served us well. In relation to the nature of development, yes, I suspect the nature of development is likely to change in response to the economic headwinds we're experiencing now, but that will be reflected in the nature of the developments coming into the system.
And I just emphasise that the tranches of projects that we're accelerating are simply the ones that we're accelerating and committing to determine within a 4-week timeframe. But as well as finalising the Tranche 1 assessments over the last 4 or so weeks, we've reached determinations as part of our business as usual activities on an additional 42 projects worth $2.4 billion, creating 4,600 jobs and almost 400 new homes. So this is not being done to the exclusion of business as usual. Rather, it's about more efficient processes internally and a redeployment of resources to do more overall. It's not a zero sum.
But Minister, in what is a very weak market with a significant reduction in demand, how can you be sure that getting these projects approved doesn't just switch development and capital from other projects that are already approved to these projects? How can you be? Do you have any analysis at all that it's actually going to increase the pool, rather than just shifting projects from money from project A to project B in what is unquestionably a very weak market?
Well, I mean, to one extent, I can't know the answer to that question. Because our role is to assess applications for development and planning proposals on the merits according to law. As to what proponents do, that's sort of a matter for them. In relation to these projects, we've got these guarantees in relation to starting them. In relation to existing approvals, they operate with lapsing conditions relating to them. Yes, I concede that we have extended those lapsing conditions because the clear feedback from industry is that there are significant difficulties in obtaining finance, so it's important that we provide a bit more time. We've also, however, tightened rules around physical commencement as well. So on the other hand, we're also doing everything we can to make sure to keep proponents honest, that when they get an approval, that it results in actual physical commencement, not merely a survey peg in the ground to activate that consent. So that's the way in which we have at least one lever to make sure that a consent is acted upon in a reasonable amount of time, or otherwise it expires.
Minister, given the extraordinary need for social and public housing at the moment, more than 60,000 people on the public housing list, will you look in further, if there are further tranches of fast-track development, will you look for projects which may be fast-tracked on the basis they convert what was previously a private market project into a public or social housing project as one of the criterias for fast-tracking?
It's not my role to look for particular projects to say to Jim, can you put this one on the list? That's not my role, and that wouldn't be an appropriate thing for me to be doing.
Well,
nevertheless,
the department. When I say you, I mean the department.
Nevertheless, that would fit entirely within the criteria that's been established by the department. That public benefit criteria relates really strongly to affordable housing, because that's one of the objects of the Act.
So, for example, if the Crown Casino project falls over, we can see that become public housing, an iconic public housing project in Sydney.
Point of order, I think you're in my time, Chair.
Sorry, you're right, Ms Ward.
Thank you. I think it's been a Herculean effort today, but I just wanted to thank the Minister and advisors for coming along, and some of the projects have actually been very exciting. and some of the opportunity for pivoting and doing some innovative things, particularly with cycleways, is to be commended from my personal perspective. Don't speak on behalf of the committee, but I do caution against too much lycra in the future, so something to be aware of.
New South Wales will rise like us.
Thank you, Chair, for indulging me.
Thank you, Ms Wood. Minister, Mr Hebron and Mr Betts, thank you all for your attendance today. And I think there were some questions taken on notice. You have 21 days. And again, on behalf of the committee, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.